You wake up one morning and somehow, impossibly, you've been transported back to ancient Rome. Not the Hollywood version, with gleaming marble columns and stoic emperors in pristine white togas. The real Rome. The Rome of 150 AD, during the height of the empire's power, when 1 million people crammed into a city that had just figured out how to manage waste through underground tunnels and pipe water from distant mountains. Your first breath tells you everything you need to know. The air carries a complex bouquet of scents. Bread baking somewhere down the street, that's pleasant enough. But beneath it, always beneath it, there's something else. The acrid tang of human waste from the streets where chamber pots were emptied from upper-story windows the night before. The sour fermentation smell of the public urinals on street corners, where men pause to relieve themselves into large ceramic jars. The musky, almost overwhelming perfume that wealthier citizens drench themselves in, trying desperately to mask the other smells. And underneath all of it, the constant presence of bodies. Millions of bodies in a city without deodorant, without modern sanitation, without any real understanding of germs or bacteria. You've heard the stories. Rome, the pinnacle of ancient civilization. The empire that built aqueducts stretching dozens of miles to bring fresh water into the city. The society that constructed elaborate public baths where citizens could gather, socialize and maintain their cleanliness. The people who pioneered underground sewer systems that flushed waste from public toilets into rivers. Surely this must have been a clean society. Surely the Romans, with all their engineering prowess and civic pride, must have lived in hygienic splendour. But as you walk these streets, as you breathe this air, as you watch your fellow Romans go about their daily routines, you begin to realise something. The truth about Roman hygiene is far more complex, far more fascinating, and far more stomach-turning than anyone ever told you. The Romans did accomplish remarkable feats of engineering. They did value cleanliness, at least in theory. They did spend hours each day at the baths, meticulously grooming themselves, but they also bathed in recycled water teeming with bacteria. They wiped themselves with shared sponges on sticks. They whitened their teeth with urine and brushed them with crushed mouse brains. They removed body hair with burning resin and pumice stones. They washed their clothes by stomping on them in vats of stale pee. The Romans lived in a world where opulence and filth existed side by side, where magnificent architecture could house genuinely disgusting practices, where the pursuit of beauty often involved substances we'd now consider hazardous waste. They inhabited a civilization that was simultaneously ahead of its time and shockingly primitive, where brilliant innovation coexisted with profound ignorance about how disease actually spreads. This is the story of what Roman hygiene was really like, not the sanitized, romanticized version we see in movies and textbooks. The real thing. The truth about how 1 million people living in close quarters managed to keep themselves clean, or at least tried to, in an era before anyone understood microbes, before soap was common, before the very concept of germs existed. This is the story of urine taxes and mouse brain toothpaste, of communal toilet sponges and recycled bathwater, of engineering brilliance and medical ignorance, of social rituals and stubborn parasites that refuse to be washed away no matter how elaborate the bathhouse. Get ready to discover why the Romans didn't smell as good as you might think, why their impressive sanitation systems didn't actually prevent disease, and why even the wealthiest emperor couldn't escape the lice, the worms, or the dysentery that plagued the empire. Get ready to learn what it really meant to be clean in ancient Rome. Spoiler alert, it meant something very different than what we might imagine. If you asked a Roman citizen what they were most proud of about their civilization, many would point to the public baths. The thermae, as the large imperial bath complexes were called, stood as monuments to Roman engineering, civic pride and social culture. These weren't just places to get clean. They were the beating heart of Roman social life, where citizens from all walks of life gathered to bathe, exercise, gossip, conduct business, and see and be seen. The architecture alone was breathtaking. The baths of Caracalla, completed around 216 AD, covered an area larger than the 11 football fields. The complex could accommodate up to 1,600 bathers at once, and in its day, it represented the pinnacle of Roman construction. The main building featured soaring vaulted ceilings up to 130 feet high, supported by massive columns of granite and marble. Mosaics covered the floors depicting athletes, sea creatures, and geometric patterns. Statues lined the halls, natural light poured in through large windows, and in the evenings hundreds of oil lamps illuminated the space with flickering golden light. But the baths of Caracalla were just one of many. By the 4th century AD, Rome boasted 856 bathing establishments of various sizes, 11 massive imperial baths, each a marvel of architecture and engineering, hundreds of smaller neighbourhood baths scattered throughout the city, and even the smallest towns across the empire, from Britain to North Africa, from Spain to Syria, eventually built their own versions of these bathing complexes. Bathing wasn't just a luxury for the wealthy, it was a fundamental part of being Roman, as essential to daily life as eating or sleeping. The typical bathing experience followed a well-established routine. You'd arrive at the baths in the afternoon, around the 8th hour by Roman reckoning, which corresponds to about 2 in the afternoon by our modern clocks. This was the most popular time, after the midday siesta but before the evening meal. The entrance fee was minimal, just a quadrans, the smallest denomination of Roman currency. Even the poorest free citizens could afford it. Children often entered for free. First, you'd head to the changing room, the aqueductorium. Here, you'd strip off your clothes and leave them in niches cut into the walls or hand them to a slave to watch. Theft was rampant at the baths. Romans even scratched curse tablets, imploring the gods to punish whoever stole their clothing. One such tablet found at the baths in Bath, England reads, "Solenus to the goddess Sulis Minerva, I give to your divinity and majesty my bathing tunic and cloak. Do not allow sleep or health to him who has done me wrong, whether man or woman, unless he reveals himself and brings those goods to your temple." Once undressed, you might begin with some exercise in the palestra, an open courtyard surrounded by columns. Here, Romans engaged in various athletic activities: wrestling, boxing, discus throwing, weightlifting. Young men showed off their physiques, and older men tried to maintain their strength. The exercise was meant to warm the body and open the pores, preparing you for the bathing sequence ahead. Slaves stood ready with strigils, curved metal scrapers, that would later remove oil, sweat, and dead skin from your body. Then came the bathing circuit itself, a carefully choreographed journey through rooms of different temperatures. You'd typically start in the tepidarium, the warm room. This was a transitional space, neither hot nor cold, where your body could adjust. The temperature here hovered around body temperature, maybe slightly warmer. You'd sit on heated benches, feeling the warmth seep into your muscles, relaxing after the day's work or the exertion of exercise. Next came the caldarium, the hot room. This was the heart of the bathing experience. Hot air circulated beneath the raised floors and through hollow spaces in the walls, a heating system called a hypocaust. Furnaces tended by slaves burned massive quantities of wood to maintain the temperature. In the caldarium you'd sweat profusely. The heat was intense, sometimes oppressive. Large windows allowed some air circulation, but the room was deliberately kept hot and humid. Here's where the actual cleaning happened. But Romans didn't use soap. Soap existed, but it was rarely used for bathing. Instead, they followed a process that might seem bizarre to modern sensibilities. Slaves would pour olive oil over your body, coating your skin liberally with the slick substance. Then you'd scrape it off with a strigil, that curved metal implement, dragging it across your skin to remove the oil along with sweat, dirt, dead skin cells, and whatever else accumulated on the body. The oil and grime would fall to the floor, forming grimy puddles that slaves constantly mopped up. This was the Roman method of getting clean: oil, sweat, and scraping. After the caldarium, you'd proceed to the frigidarium, the cold room. This was usually an unheated space with a pool of cold water. Romans believed that plunging into cold water after the hot rooms was invigorating and healthful. The shock to the system was considered good for circulation and vitality. Modern swimmers practicing cold water immersion would recognise the theory, even if the execution was somewhat different. Some bath complexes also featured special rooms. The Laconicum was a dry, extremely hot room similar to a modern sauna. The Sudatorium was a steam room. The larger imperial baths had outdoor swimming pools, gardens, libraries, lecture halls, and even shops selling food, drinks, and other goods. But here's where the reality of Roman bathing starts to diverge from our idealised image of cleanliness. All this bathing happened in communal pools and rooms. The water in these pools wasn't changed frequently. It couldn't be. Even with Rome's impressive aqueduct system, replacing thousands of gallons of water daily in multiple pools across hundreds of baths would have been impossible. Instead, the same water sat there, day after day, gradually accumulating not just the natural oils and dead skin cells from bathers, but also sweat, urine, feces, pus from open wounds, and every microbe that the bathers carried. The water in the hot pools was kept warm, providing perfect conditions for bacteria to thrive. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, famously complained about the offensive mixture of oil, sweat, dirtiness, and water that filled the baths. He wasn't wrong. The lukewarm, stagnant water in Roman baths was essentially a bacterial soup, a perfect breeding ground for pathogens of all kinds. Romans with open wounds bathed alongside healthy citizens. The sick bathed with the well. The ancient physician Celsus explicitly warned people not to visit the baths with fresh wounds because of the risk of gangrene. Think about what that means. People understood that the bath water could cause infection severe enough to kill, and yet they continued to bathe in it daily. The social and hygienic expectations were so strong that people accepted the risk. Archaeological evidence confirms what common sense suggests. The baths were disease transmission hotspots. Parasites that require water for their life cycle would have flourished in Roman bath complexes. Intestinal parasites like whipworm and roundworm, which can spread through fecal contamination of water, were widespread in the Roman population. Schistosomiasis, a parasitic disease transmitted through freshwater snails, may have been spread by Roman bathing practices. The famous English spa at Bath, fed by natural hot springs, was closed in 1978 after a young girl contracted a deadly brain-eating amoeba called Naegleria fowleri. The same organism likely existed in Roman baths that used similar natural spring water. But Romans remained blissfully ignorant of these dangers. They had no concept of germs or microbes. The theory that tiny invisible creatures could cause disease wouldn't be proposed for more than 500 years. To the Romans, disease was caused by bad air, by imbalances in the body's humours, by divine punishment for moral failings, not by microscopic organisms breeding in the tepid water they soaked in daily. The social aspect of bathing also created its own complications. Men and women sometimes bathed together, although this practice varied by location and time period. Mixed bathing was controversial. Conservative Romans saw it as morally degenerate. Various emperors issued decrees trying to regulate or prohibit mixed bathing, with limited success. The reality on the ground often differed from official policy. Regardless of whether bathing was segregated or mixed, the baths were crowded, noisy, chaotic places. The Roman writer Seneca, who lived above a bathhouse, complained bitterly about the din. He described the grunts of men exercising, the slap of masseurs pounding flesh, the shouts of vendors selling food and drinks, the splash of people jumping into pools, the cries of those getting their armpits plucked by tweezers. The baths were anything but peaceful. Sexual activity was also common at the baths, despite official disapproval. Male prostitutes worked the bathhouses, offering their services to interested clientele. The baths were places where social and sexual connections were made, where affairs began, where the usual rules of public propriety were somewhat relaxed. The combination of nakedness, warm water, oil and massage created an atmosphere that encouraged intimacy. Theft, as mentioned earlier, was endemic. Despite the warnings on curse tablets, clothes and valuables regularly disappeared from the changing rooms. Wealthy bathers brought slaves specifically to guard their belongings. The poor had to risk it or skip the baths entirely, though for most Romans the social pressure to bathe regularly was too strong to resist. The baths also served as crude medical centres. People went there hoping the warm water would ease their aches and pains, soothe their arthritis, or cure various ailments. The hot springs at Bath in England were sacred to the goddess Sulis Minerva, and Romans travelled there seeking healing. Doctors sometimes prescribed bathing as treatment for various conditions. The therapeutic benefits were real, at least for some conditions. Warm water does ease muscle pain and improve circulation, but the potential for contracting disease in the baths probably cancelled out many of the benefits. The engineering required to maintain these bath complexes was staggering. The Hippocaust heating system required constant attention. Slaves worked around the clock stoking furnaces, hauling wood, maintaining the equipment. The aqueducts bringing water to the baths had to be kept in good repair. The drains carrying away used water needed regular cleaning. Wealthy patrons sometimes sponsored free bathing days, subsidising the operating costs to gain political favour with the populace. Despite all the problems, all the disease transmission, all the chaos and noise and theft, Romans loved their baths. They spent hours there daily. They conducted business deals while soaking in the pools. They gossiped, networked, and socialised. The baths were where you went to see and be seen, to maintain your status, to demonstrate that you were a civilised person who cared about cleanliness and propriety. To be Roman was to bathe. Even soldiers stationed on Hadrian's Wall in the freezing north of Britain had their own bathhouses, smaller replicas of the Grand Thermae in Rome. Roman colonists built baths wherever they settled. The practice spread across the empire, becoming a defining feature of Roman civilization. When the Western Roman Empire fell in the 5th century, the elaborate bathing culture began to fade. The knowledge and resources needed to maintain such complexes disappeared. Medieval Europeans largely abandoned public bathing, partly because the Christian Church associated bathhouses with moral decadence. But for the Romans themselves, the baths represented the height of civilization. They couldn't conceive of a cultured life without daily bathing. The fact that their bathing practices probably spread more disease than they prevented would have shocked them. They believed absolutely in the health benefits of the baths, in the cleansing power of water and oil, in the social necessity of regular bathing. And in some ways, they weren't entirely wrong. Bathing, even in less than ideal conditions, was better than not bathing at all. The Romans smelled better than they would have without the baths. They felt better, looked better, and functioned as a more cohesive society because of these communal spaces. The baths were one of Rome's greatest achievements, even if they weren't quite as hygienic as the Romans believed them to be. If the baths represented the sophisticated side of Roman sanitation, the public toilets revealed its more brutal realities. Walking into a Roman public latrine for the first time would have been a shocking experience by modern standards. These weren't private stalls with locking doors. They were communal facilities where Romans sat shoulder to shoulder, sometimes dozens of them in a row, conducting their business in full view of one another while chatting about politics, weather, or the latest gladiatorial games. The archaeological remains of these latrines are remarkably well preserved. The best example sits at Housestead's Roman fort along Hadrian's Wall in northern England. Here you can still see the stone benches with keyhole-shaped openings cut into them, positioned at regular intervals. 20 or 30 of these seats line the walls in an L shape or rectangle. They sat over a deep channel through which water constantly flowed, carrying waste away to the sewer system. In front of the seats, a shallow gutter carried clean water, which served a very specific purpose that we'll discuss shortly. These public latrines, called forcae, were built in most Roman cities starting in the 2nd century BC. They were often donated by wealthy citizens as public works, a way to curry favour with the populace and demonstrate civic virtue. But interestingly, we rarely find the donors' names inscribed on the walls. Unlike baths, theatres or forums, no one wanted to be remembered as the guy who built the toilet. This tells us something important. Even Romans, for all their acceptance of communal toileting, recognised that the latrines were fundamentally undignified places. The facilities were dark. Most had small high windows that provided minimal light. The stench must have been overwhelming. Dozens of people defecating in close quarters, with limited ventilation, in a hot Mediterranean climate. The sewers below carried waste, but they also harboured rats, insects, and other vermin. The waste channel was often connected directly to the main sewer lines, but the connection wasn't always perfect. Sometimes blockages occurred. Sometimes the water flow was insufficient to carry everything away cleanly. And then there was the question of wiping. Romans didn't have toilet paper. Instead, they used something called a tersorium, which was essentially a sea sponge attached to the end of a stick. This implement was rinsed in the gutter of constantly flowing water in front of the toilet seats, and then shared among all the users of the latrine. Yes, shared. The same sponge that the person next to you just used to clean themselves, you would then use to clean yourself. Think about that for a moment. A damp sponge used by multiple people, rinsed in water that ran along the floor of a public restroom. This was the Roman version of toilet paper. It was, from a disease transmission standpoint, an absolute nightmare. Intestinal parasites that spread through fecal-oral contamination would have had a perfect vector. Dysentery, caused by bacteria or amoebas, could spread easily through this shared wiping implement. The very tool meant to maintain cleanliness became an instrument of disease transmission. Some researchers have questioned whether the tersorium was actually used for personal hygiene or whether it was meant for cleaning the toilet seats themselves. But historical sources seem clear. References in ancient texts describe the sponge stick as a personal hygiene tool. One famous story tells of a Germanic gladiator who committed suicide by shoving the sponge stick down his throat. The implication is clear. This was an object that regularly came into contact with the most intimate parts of the body. Privacy was non-existent in these facilities. You'd sit down next to strangers, colleagues, maybe even your employer, and conduct your business while maintaining casual conversation. This might seem bizarre to modern sensibilities, but it was completely normal for Romans. The latrine was a social space. People made deals, discussed politics, and exchanged gossip while simultaneously attending to their bodily functions. Women rarely used these public facilities. The historical record is unclear about whether women were formally excluded or simply chose not to use them, but the evidence suggests that public latrines were overwhelmingly male spaces. Upper-class women certainly never used them. Even lower-class women probably avoided them when possible. A woman entering a public latrine would risk her reputation, and potentially her safety. There are documented cases of women being assaulted in such spaces, but the lack of female participation in public latrines creates a puzzle. Where did women go? We'll get to that in a moment, but first let's talk about the dangers lurking in those toilet seats. Romans were genuinely afraid of their toilets, not because of disease, which they couldn't understand, but because of creatures that might emerge from the sewers below. Ancient sources describe rats, snakes, and even octopi coming up through the pipes. The writer Aelian tells a story of a wealthy merchant in Puteoli whose pantry kept mysteriously losing pickled fish. Eventually they discovered a giant octopus was swimming into the sewer from the sea, climbing up through the toilet drain and sneaking into the storage room to feast. Whether this story is true or exaggerated, it reveals Roman fears about what might emerge from below. But the real dangers were more mundane, if no less concerning. Gases from decomposing waste could build up in the sewer systems. Methane and other gases are not only foul-smelling but potentially explosive. Workers who maintained the sewers, usually slaves or prisoners, faced genuine danger from toxic fumes. The channels beneath the latrines were damp, dark environments perfect for breeding insects and vermin. Mosquitoes, flies, and other disease-carrying pests would have thrived there. Because of these perceived dangers, Romans often placed protective symbols in their latrines. Archaeological excavations have found mosaics of the goddess Fortuna in many toilet facilities. Fortuna was the goddess of luck and fortune, and her presence was meant to protect toilet users from the various dangers, both real and imagined, that lurked in these spaces. Graffiti on latrine walls sometimes includes protective spells or warnings to malevolent spirits. For wealthier Romans, there was an alternative to these communal nightmares: private toilets called latrinae in their homes. These were typically built over cesspits rather than connected to the sewer system. The wealthy deliberately avoided connecting their home toilets to the public sewers because they feared rats, snakes, and bad air coming up through the pipes into their houses. Instead, they hired specialised workers called stercorari to periodically empty their cesspits. These manure removers had one of the most unpleasant jobs in Rome, but it was steady work, and someone had to do it. The private latrine was usually located near the kitchen. This seems counterintuitive by modern standards, but there was logic to it. Food scraps could be easily disposed of in the toilet pit, and the kitchen slaves could manage both cooking and waste disposal from the same area. Of course, this proximity also meant that flies moving between the cesspit and the food preparation area could easily contaminate meals, but Romans had no understanding of how disease spread through such vectors. Even in wealthy homes, the toilet experience wasn't particularly comfortable. The latrina was typically a small, dark room with a hole in a wooden or stone seat. No window, no ventilation beyond a small opening at the top. The smell from the cesspit below would have been ever present. Some households tried to mask it with perfumes or burning incense, but nothing could fully eliminate the stench of human waste decomposing in a pit beneath your home. For the vast majority of Romans, particularly those living in multi-storey apartment buildings called insulae, there was a third option: chamber pots. These ceramic vessels were kept in individual rooms and used for nighttime needs, or when it was inconvenient to go to the public latrine. Once full, they were supposed to be emptied into the sewer or latrine. In practice, many residents simply threw the contents out the window into the street below. This was such a common problem that it became a significant public health hazard. Walking the streets of Rome at night was genuinely dangerous, not just from criminals but from the risk of being doused with the contents of a chamber pot. The satirist Juvenal wrote warnings about this hazard, describing how pedestrians needed to make a will before going out at night because of the risk of having excrement dumped on their heads from above. Some landlords installed latrines on the ground floors of apartment buildings, sharing them among all the residents. But tenants on upper floors often couldn't be bothered to walk down multiple flights of stairs. The result was streets perpetually covered in a mixture of rainwater, waste, rotting vegetables, animal droppings, and whatever else people threw out their windows. Stepping stones were placed at intersections so pedestrians could cross without wading through the filth. Despite laws prohibiting the dumping of waste into streets, enforcement was minimal. There was no police force in the modern sense, no sanitation department making sure people disposed of waste properly. Officials called aediles were supposed to oversee public sanitation, but in the poorer neighbourhoods they were largely ineffective. The streets of those districts were, by all accounts, absolutely disgusting. Now back to that question about women. If they didn't use public latrines, what did they do? Wealthy women used chamber pots, attended by slaves who emptied them. Middle-class women probably did the same, or used private latrines in their homes when available. Poor women faced a more difficult situation. Some probably did brave the public latrines when absolutely necessary, despite the social stigma and potential dangers. Others likely found private spots in alleys or used chamber pots like everyone else. Children were trained to use these facilities from a young age. Archaeological evidence shows miniature chamber pots designed for children. parents taught their kids the social norms around defecation and urination, though the exact methods of toilet training aren't well documented in ancient sources. Given the communal nature of most toilet facilities, children would have been exposed to these practices from their earliest years, learning by observation what was considered normal. The sewers beneath these latrines were engineering marvels, at least by ancient standards. The Cloaca Maxima, Rome's main sewer, was large enough for a cart to drive through. Built originally by the Etruscans around 600 BC, the system was expanded and improved over centuries. Stone-lined tunnels carried waste and rainwater from across the city, emptying into the Tiber River. But these sewers were designed primarily for drainage, not sanitation. They were meant to carry away rainwater and overflow from fountains, with human waste as an afterthought. Most homes, even in the city centre, weren't connected to the sewer system. Many public latrines were, but the connection was often imperfect. Blockages occurred. Overflow happened. The sewers required regular maintenance by gangs of slaves who descended into the dark tunnels to clear debris and repair damage. The Cloaca Maxima emptied directly into the Tiber, which was also a source of drinking water for some Romans, particularly the poor who couldn't access the aqueduct-fed public fountains. The wealthy knew better than to drink Tiber water, but they used it for irrigation and sometimes for bathing. The river carried waste downstream, theoretically away from the city, but in reality the contamination spread up and down the river, creating perfect conditions for waterborne diseases to flourish. For all their engineering skill, for all their civic pride in their sanitation infrastructure, the Romans never solved the fundamental problem of waste disposal in a densely populated city. They built impressive toilets, elaborate sewers, and complex drainage systems, but they emptied everything into rivers that people still used for other purposes. They created communal facilities that brought efficiency at the cost of privacy and disease control. They engineered solutions to some problems while inadvertently creating others. The Roman toilet experience reveals the contradictions at the heart of Roman hygiene. They valued cleanliness and social propriety, building public facilities so citizens wouldn't have to live surrounded by waste. But those facilities were themselves vectors of disease, spreading parasites and bacteria through shared implements, and contaminated water. They created an infrastructure that seemed advanced but was in many ways making their public health problems worse. And yet, Romans didn't know this. They couldn't know it. Without an understanding of how disease spreads, without knowledge of microorganisms, they operated with the best information they had. They knew that concentrated waste was unpleasant, and probably unhealthy in some vague way. They knew that removing it from living spaces was desirable. They built systems to do that, and by ancient standards those systems were revolutionary. But sitting on that stone bench, shoulder to shoulder with strangers, wiping yourself with a shared sponge on a stick while rats scurried in the sewers below and flies buzzed overhead, you'd have a very different perspective on Roman sanitation than the one presented in most history books. You'd understand viscerally that being Roman meant accepting a level of communal intimacy, physical discomfort and disease risk that modern people would find intolerable. The toilets of Rome were marvels of engineering and monuments to dysfunction, symbols of civic progress and petri dishes of disease, all at the same time. The Romans were justifiably proud of their sewer system. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century AD, called it the most noteworthy of all Roman achievements. Pliny wasn't exaggerating the ambition of the project, even if he was perhaps too optimistic about its effectiveness. The network of underground channels that drained Rome represented a massive investment of labour, engineering skill, and civic resources. But as impressive as the system was architecturally, its actual impact on public health was far more complicated than the Romans realised. The foundation of Rome's sewer system was the Cloaca Maxima, the Great Sewer. Originally built by the Etruscans around 600 BC to drain the marshy valley between Rome's hills, it was expanded and improved over centuries. By the time of the Empire, the Cloaca Maxima was a vast stone-lined tunnel, large enough in some sections for a wagon to pass through. It ran for more than half a mile, collecting drainage from various parts of the city before emptying into the Tiber River. Branching off from this main artery were hundreds of smaller sewers, creating a network that served much of the urban core. These subsidiary channels varied in size and construction quality. Some were carefully built stone tunnels, others were simple ditches covered with stone slabs. The wealthiest areas had the best drainage. The poorest neighbourhoods often made do with open ditches or no sewers at all. The engineering required to create this system was formidable. The sewers had to maintain a steady gradient to keep water flowing. Too steep, and the water would rush through without carrying the solid waste. Too shallow, and everything would back up and overflow. Roman engineers had to calculate these grades using primitive surveying equipment, yet they managed to create a system that for the most part functioned as intended. Water was the key to the system's operation. The sewers relied on a constant flow to carry away waste. This flow came from multiple sources: rainwater from storms, overflow from public fountains, and most importantly, runoff from the aqueducts. The Romans deliberately built their aqueduct system to provide excess water specifically to flush the sewers. Frontinus, the water commissioner appointed by Emperor Nerva, explicitly noted that overflow was necessary for the health of the city, but also for use in the flushing of the sewers. This meant the sewers worked best when it rained, or when the aqueducts were running at full capacity. During dry periods the flow slowed. Solid waste accumulated. The smell intensified. This seasonal variation in sewer performance was one of many factors that complicated their effectiveness. Maintaining the system required constant labour. Slaves and prisoners were sent into the tunnels to clear blockages, remove accumulated debris, and repair damaged sections. This was dangerous work. The sewers were dark, filled with noxious gases, and structurally unstable in places. Cave-ins were not uncommon. Men died in those tunnels, though their deaths went largely unrecorded in the historical sources that focused on emperors and senators, rather than the enslaved workers who kept the infrastructure functioning. Despite the impressive engineering, the Roman sewer system had significant limitations. Most importantly, most private homes weren't connected to it. The insulae, the multi-storey apartment buildings where the majority of Romans lived, typically had no plumbing at all. Residents used chamber pots and either carried them to the nearest sewer opening or, more often, simply dumped them out the window. Even wealthy homes with private latrines often chose not to connect them to the public sewers. The reason was fear. Romans understood that connecting your private toilet to the public sewer meant creating a direct channel between your home and the filth of the city. Rats and snakes could theoretically enter through that channel. Noxious gases could seep into your house. Disease, which they associated with bad air, might flow in through those pipes. These fears weren't entirely unfounded. The sewers did harbour rats, insects, and various other vermin. They did produce toxic gases, and while the Romans didn't understand the mechanism, they were right that connection to the sewer system created health risks. The dangers they imagined were different from the actual risks, but the instinct to keep sewage separate from living spaces was sound. Public facilities, including the foracae and the public baths, were connected to the sewers. But here's where things got complicated. Many of these connections were imperfect. Pipes leaked. Joints came loose over time. Terracotta pipes, the standard plumbing material, were held together with a kind of cement, but the seals degraded. Archaeologists examining sites like Pompeii and Herculaneum have found evidence of extensive leakage from these pipes, with fecal material seeping into the walls of buildings and oozing down the outside. This meant that while waste was theoretically being carried away through enclosed pipes, in practice, a significant amount was leaking into the surrounding structures. Buildings in Roman cities were literally soaked with sewage in many cases. The smell alone must have been overwhelming, but beyond the smell, this leakage created perfect conditions for disease transmission. The streets themselves were another weak point in the sanitation system. Rome had no organised garbage collection service. There was no department of sanitation sending workers to pick up trash from homes and businesses. Instead, Romans were expected to dispose of their own waste. Official edicts prohibited dumping garbage and excrement in the streets, but enforcement was minimal to non-existent. The result was streets perpetually littered with waste. Butchers threw animal parts and offal into the gutters, merchants dumped spoiled produce, craftsmen discarded the byproducts of their trades, tanners, who worked with animal hides and used urine and feces in their processing, created particularly noxious waste. Dyers disposed of chemicals and residues. The accumulated refuse in the streets could become so thick that stepping stones were necessary at intersections, so pedestrians could cross without wading through the muck. Rain would theoretically wash this street waste into the storm drains and eventually into the sewers, but heavy rain also caused the sewers to overflow, backing up into streets and flooding lower-lying areas with a mixture of sewage and stormwater. The system was designed for the normal weather patterns of central Italy. Unusual storms could overwhelm it entirely. The aediles, city officials responsible for public works, were supposed to maintain street cleanliness, but their powers were limited, and in the densely packed neighbourhoods of the poor their authority was often ignored. Some streets in these areas hadn't been cleaned in decades. The ground level of the city gradually rose over time as new buildings were constructed on top of compacted layers of trash and rubble. The sewers also emptied into the Tiber River, which created an obvious problem. The Tiber wasn't just a waste disposal system, it was also a source of water for irrigation, washing, and for the poorest Romans, even drinking. The aqueducts brought clean water from distant sources, but not everyone had access to the public fountains those aqueducts supplied. The poor often drew water directly from the Tiber, despite knowing, at least vaguely, that sewage emptied into it upstream. This created a perfect cycle for disease transmission. Waste from the city entered the river. People drew water from the river. Parasites and pathogens from the waste infected new hosts. Those hosts added their own waste back to the system, continuing the cycle. The Romans had inadvertently created an efficient disease distribution network right alongside their impressive sewage infrastructure. Different aqueducts brought water of varying quality into the city. Roman engineers understood that some sources produced better water than others. Frontinus, in his capacity as water commissioner, even attempted to rationalise the system, reserving the highest quality water for drinking and cooking, sending medium quality water to public fountains and baths, and using the lowest quality water for flushing sewers and industrial purposes. But maintaining these distinctions was difficult. The water distribution system was complex, with miles of lead pipes running under and through the city. These pipes leaked, they broke, they required constant maintenance, and they created their own health hazard: lead poisoning. The Romans knew lead was poisonous in large quantities. Mining lead was a punishment assigned to criminals and enslaved people, who often died from the exposure. But they didn't realise that chronic low-level exposure from water pipes was also harmful. Modern analysis of Roman bones shows elevated lead levels consistent with chronic poisoning. This may have contributed to various health problems, from anemia to cognitive impairment, though the exact impact is debated among scholars. The water flowed continuously through Roman fountains and public facilities. Unlike modern plumbing with taps that can be turned on and off, Roman aqueducts ran constantly. Water poured into distribution tanks called castella, then flowed through pipes to various destinations, overflowing into the sewers to maintain their flushing action. This continuous flow was necessary to keep the system working, but it also represented a massive waste of water by modern standards. During sieges or times of conflict, the aqueducts became military targets. In 537 AD, the Goths besieged Rome and cut the aqueducts, trying to force the city to surrender. The Roman general Belisarius had to block the aqueduct channels from inside the city to prevent enemies from entering through them. With the aqueducts cut, the fountains ran dry, the baths closed, and the sewers stopped functioning properly. The city's elaborate infrastructure collapsed within days, revealing how dependent Rome had become on its water supply. What's fascinating from a historical perspective is how the Roman sanitation system succeeded and failed simultaneously. As an engineering achievement, it was remarkable. The construction of underground sewers, the creation of a water distribution network bringing supplies from dozens of miles away, the integration of these systems with public facilities, all demonstrated impressive technical skill and organisational capacity. But from a public health standpoint, the results were mixed at best. Archaeological evidence shows that Romans suffered from high rates of intestinal parasites, waterborne diseases, and bacterial infections. The sanitation infrastructure may have actually increased some disease transmission by facilitating the spread of pathogens through contaminated water and creating environments where disease vectors like mosquitoes and flies could breed. Modern researchers studying parasite remains in Roman archaeological sites have found that disease rates actually increased during the Roman period compared to the Iron Age that preceded it. Despite all the aqueducts, sewers, public latrines and baths, Romans were paradoxically less healthy in some ways than their less technologically advanced ancestors. The concentration of population in cities, the communal nature of sanitation facilities, and the interconnection of water systems all contributed to disease spread. Romans couldn't understand this. They built their sanitation systems based on the medical and scientific understanding of their time. They believed disease came from bad air, from imbalances in bodily humours, from divine punishment. The idea that invisible microorganisms in water and waste could cause illness was completely foreign to their worldview. They built impressive infrastructure to remove waste from sight and smell, thinking that would protect public health, not realising they were sometimes creating more efficient disease transmission pathways. The sewers of Rome stand as testament to both human ingenuity and human limitations. They show what ancient engineers could accomplish with primitive tools and no real understanding of disease causation. They represent a civilization trying to solve public health problems with the knowledge available to them, achieving partial success while inadvertently creating new problems they couldn't even recognise. The sewers worked, after a fashion, but not in the way Romans thought they did. Let's talk about Roman teeth. If there's one area where modern archaeological science has provided surprising revelations about Roman life, it's dental health. The skeletons recovered from Pompeii and Herculaneum, those unfortunate cities frozen in time by Mount Vesuvius's eruption in 79 AD, tell us something unexpected. Romans actually had remarkably good teeth. Not because of their oral hygiene practices, which were by modern standards horrifying, but rather despite them, thanks largely to their diet. The volcanic ash that buried Pompeii preserved bodies at the moment of death, creating perfect moulds that capture details modern archaeologists can study. When researchers analysed the teeth of these victims, they found low rates of cavities and relatively healthy gums, even among lower-class citizens. The reason wasn't superior dental care, it was sugar, or rather, the lack of it. Granulated sugar wasn't refined until the 5th century AD in India, and wouldn't become common in Europe until much later. Romans had honey, which is sweet, and they ate fruits, which contain natural sugars. But their overall sugar consumption was minimal compared to modern standards. Their diet was rich in whole grains, vegetables, and limited amounts of meat and dairy. This alkaline low-sugar diet was excellent for dental health, naturally preventing the type of rapid tooth decay that plagues modern populations. But Romans didn't rest on their dietary advantages. They actively pursued dental hygiene, using methods that range from sensible to absolutely revolting. Let's start with the basics, brushing teeth. Romans used frayed sticks as toothbrushes, similar to the miswak sticks still used in some parts of the Middle East today. These were typically made from aromatic woods like cinnamon or olive. The end of the stick would be chewed until it formed a bristled brush, which could then be used to scrub the teeth. But you need more than a brush. You need something abrasive to actually clean the teeth. This is where Roman dental care gets interesting. The abrasive powder they used, called dentifricium, contained a mixture of ingredients including pumice stone, crushed bones, oyster shells, eggshells, and ashes. These are all genuinely abrasive materials that would have been effective at removing plaque and surface stains. They would also have been quite harsh on tooth enamel, gradually wearing it away with repeated use. Some recipes for dentifricium got more exotic. Crushed mouse brains appeared in some formulations. Why mouse brains? We don't know for certain, but it may have been based on the principle of sympathetic magic, the idea that eating or using parts of animals might confer their qualities. Mice have strong front teeth, so perhaps using mouse brains would strengthen human teeth. The logic doesn't hold up to modern scrutiny, but in the context of Roman medical thinking, which was heavily influenced by magical and philosophical concepts, it made a certain kind of sense. The Roman poet Ovid described various beauty and hygiene practices in his poem Ars Amatoria, The Art of Love, and he included dental care in his recommendations. He emphasized that women, in particular, should take care of their teeth, though he also insisted that men should never see them in the process of doing so. The application of dental powders and treatments was meant to happen in private, in a small room where men didn't enter. Now we come to the most notorious aspect of Roman dental hygiene: urine. Romans used urine as mouthwash. Let that sink in for a moment. They would swish human urine around in their mouths to clean and whiten their teeth. Before you recoil in horror, there's actually science behind this practice. Urine contains ammonia, and ammonia is an effective cleaning agent with genuine antibacterial properties. It also has mild bleaching effects that would have helped whiten teeth. But there's a vast difference between acknowledging that something works and recommending it. Modern chemistry can explain why urine as mouthwash functioned as a teeth whitener. That doesn't mean it was a good idea. The ammonia in urine is powerful enough to be irritating to soft tissues. Regular use would have damaged gums and the inside of the mouth, and while the ammonia might kill some bacteria, the urine itself contained others. This was biological fluid from another person, full of whatever compounds and microorganisms their body was expelling. The practice was so common that there was an actual trade in urine. Fullers, the laundry workers we'll discuss in detail later, needed large quantities of urine for cleaning clothes. But there was also demand from people wanting to use it for dental purposes. Collectors would place large jars at street corners where passers-by could urinate. These jars would then be sold to fullers, to tanners who used urine in leather processing, and presumably to anyone else who wanted to purchase urine for dental or cosmetic purposes. Portuguese urine was considered especially desirable and was imported to Rome at significant cost. Why Portuguese urine? The sources don't explain, but it may have been related to diet. Different diets produce urine with different concentrations of ammonia and other compounds. Whatever the reason, Portuguese urine was premium product in the Roman market. This urine trade became so economically significant that Emperor Vespasian, who ruled from 69-79 AD, decided to tax it. This wasn't just any tax, it was specifically a tax on the collection of urine from public urinals. The emperor's son, Titus, reportedly complained about the undignified nature of taxing something so base. Vespasian's response became famous. He held up a gold coin, asked his son if it smelled bad, and when Titus said no, Vespasian replied, "Pecunia non olet," money doesn't smell. This phrase entered the Latin language as a proverb, and is still used today to express the idea that money has no inherent moral quality. For all their efforts at dental hygiene, Romans still suffered from tooth problems. Toothaches were common. Gum disease afflicted many, and when teeth became too problematic, they needed to be removed. Roman dentistry existed, but it was primitive and painful. Tooth extraction was performed without anaesthesia, though patients might be given wine to dull their senses somewhat. The tools used were essentially pliers, designed to grip the tooth and yank it out. The Roman medical writer Celsus described various dental procedures, including methods for extracting teeth and attempting to fill cavities. Cavities were sometimes filled with materials like lead and cotton fibres. This didn't work well. Lead is toxic, and inserting it directly into exposed dental pulp would have caused additional problems. But Romans didn't understand this. They were trying to solve the problem of tooth decay with the knowledge and materials available to them. They also understood that loose teeth could result from gum disease or weakening roots. Treatment involved cauterizing the gums, with hot irons and then applying a mixture of honey and mead. This barbaric-sounding procedure probably did help in some cases. Cauterizing infected gum tissue could halt the spread of infection, and honey has genuine antimicrobial properties that modern medicine has rediscovered. But performing this procedure without anesthesia, using crude tools, must have been agonizing. Dental prosthetics existed in the Roman world, inherited from the Etruscans who had developed impressive dental bridgework by the 7th century BC. These bridges used gold wire to connect false teeth, often carved from ivory or animal bone, to existing teeth. The craftsmanship was remarkable. Some of these prosthetics were purely cosmetic, worn only for appearance and removed before eating. Others were functional enough to allow their wearers to chew soft foods. Roman law even addressed dental prosthetics. The 12 Tables, Rome's foundational legal code, included provisions about gold dental work. One law prohibited burying corpses with gold jewellery or ornaments, but specifically exempted gold dental prosthetics. Scholars interpret this to mean that gold dental work was common enough and expensive enough to warrant legal attention. People who could afford gold bridges or crowns wanted to keep them even in death, and the law permitted it. The Roman medical writer Scribonius Largus claimed that Messalina, the wife of Emperor Claudius, used a special toothpaste made from mastic, sal ammoniac, ammonium chloride, and calcified stag horns. Whether this is true or just gossip is unclear, but it tells us that elite Romans pursued exotic dental care products, and that having white, clean teeth was a status symbol. Toothpicks were another important dental hygiene tool. Called dentiscalpium, these picks were usually made from lentisk wood, which has pleasant aromatic properties. Some wealthy Romans had toothpicks made from more exotic materials like porcupine quills, which Pliny claimed would harden the teeth, or even gold and silver. The naturalist Pliny the Elder made many claims about toothpick materials, including that vulture quills would freshen breath. These claims weren't based on any real evidence, but rather on the system of correspondences and magical thinking that characterized much of Roman natural history. The general population couldn't afford exotic toothpicks or expensive dental treatments. They made do with whatever abrasive powders they could prepare at home, using sticks from local trees and hoping their teeth would last. And for the most part, thanks to their diet, their teeth did last reasonably well. Only about 1/3 of the skeletons from Pompeii show missing teeth, which is actually quite good by ancient standards. But dental pain was a constant spectre. Infected teeth could develop abscesses could turn septic, and sepsis, before antibiotics, was often fatal. Romans genuinely died from toothaches, from infections that began in the mouth and spread throughout the body. This is why they took dental hygiene seriously despite their strange methods. The stakes were high. Some Romans turned to religion when dental problems became severe. St. Apollonia became the patron saint of dentistry and toothaches in Christian tradition. According to legend, she was an elderly Christian woman in Alexandria during the 3rd century who was brutally beaten by a mob of pagans. Her teeth were knocked out, and she was threatened with being burned alive if she didn't renounce her faith. Instead, she threw herself into the flames. Afterward, Christians suffering from dental pain would pray to her for relief. The story reveals several things. First, that dental trauma and pain were common enough that Christians felt the need for a patron saint specifically for this affliction. Second, that violent tooth loss was used as a form of torture, suggesting that Romans understood how painful dental injuries could be. Third, that the intersection of religion and medicine extended even to dentistry. Roman understanding of teeth was limited, but not entirely wrong. The physician Galen correctly identified that teeth contained nerves, and that these nerves were responsible for dental pain. He classified teeth as a type of bone, but noted they had unique properties. This was more accurate than some earlier thinkers who believed teeth were something entirely different from bone. Galen's anatomical studies, conducted primarily on animals since human dissection was restricted, gave him insights that advanced medical knowledge. But Galen and his contemporaries also believed in things like the toothworm, a mythical creature that supposedly bored into teeth and caused cavities. This theory persisted for centuries, even though no one ever actually observed a toothworm. The theory made sense within the framework of how Romans understood disease. If something was damaged, something must be damaging it. Since teeth developed holes, something must be drilling those holes. The idea of invisible bacterial action causing demineralization through acid production was beyond their conceptual framework. Despite all the strange ingredients and methods, Roman dental hygiene did work to some extent. The mechanical action of brushing with abrasive powder would have removed plaque. The aromatic woods they chewed probably had some antibacterial properties. Even the urine, disgusting as it was, did function as an antiseptic. Combined with their low-sugar diet, these practices helped Romans maintain reasonably healthy teeth throughout their lives. But they couldn't prevent all dental disease. They couldn't treat serious infections effectively. And when dental problems became severe, the treatments available were painful, largely ineffective, and sometimes more dangerous than the original problem. Romans approached dental care with the same mix of practical wisdom and profound ignorance that characterized most of their medical practice. They got some things right, many things wrong, and suffered through the consequences while believing they were doing the best possible thing for their health. Walking into the private chambers of a wealthy Roman woman in the middle of her beauty routine would have been like stepping into a combination chemistry lab, torture chamber, and perfume shop. The air would be thick with competing scents: rosewater, myrrh, frankincense fighting against the underlying odours of animal fat, crushed insects, and various other substances that modern people would consider anything but beautifying. Slave women called cosmeti would be attending their mistress, applying an array of creams, powders, and tinctures, each with its own specific purpose in the elaborate ritual of Roman beauty. Beauty in ancient Rome was serious business. Your appearance didn't just reflect your personal standards, it broadcast your social status, your wealth, your moral character. A well-groomed Roman was a civilized Roman. Neglecting your appearance suggested poverty, barbarism, or moral failing. So Romans, especially but not exclusively wealthy women, devoted significant time and resources to grooming and beautification. The ideal Roman beauty had pale, smooth skin completely free of blemishes, freckles, or sunspots. Dark eyes lined with kohl, rosy cheeks, white, even teeth, and carefully arranged hair in elaborate styles that changed with fashion over the decades. Achieving these standards required an extensive arsenal of cosmetic products, many of which were genuinely toxic. Let's start with the foundation of Roman beauty: skin whitening. Pale skin was the ultimate marker of elite status. If you were pale, you obviously didn't work outside in the sun like a peasant. You could afford to stay indoors or have slaves carry you in a covered litter when you travelled. This obsession with pale skin led Romans to apply various whitening agents to their faces, necks, and sometimes their entire bodies. The most effective whitener was also the most dangerous: white lead. Lead carbonate, also called ceruse, created a smooth white coating that covered imperfections and gave the skin a porcelain appearance. Roman women mixed this lead powder with water or vinegar to create a paste that they spread across their faces. The result was certainly white, but it was also poisoning them slowly with every application. The Romans knew, at least vaguely, that lead was poisonous. Mining lead was a punishment for criminals precisely because the work killed them. But they didn't understand that chronic low-level exposure through cosmetics was also harmful. Women who used lead makeup regularly suffered from a range of symptoms: fatigue, constipation, abdominal pain, and eventually more serious neurological effects. Lead poisoning causes infertility, damages the brain, and shortens lifespan. Roman women literally sacrificed their health and their ability to bear children in pursuit of pale skin, and they didn't stop with lead. Other whitening formulas included chalk, white clay called fuller's earth, and various plant extracts. Some women bathed in ass's milk, following the example of Poppaea Sabina, the wife of Emperor Nero. Poppaea supposedly travelled with a herd of 500 donkeys to ensure she always had fresh milk for her baths. Whether this actually whitened the skin is debatable, but it certainly demonstrated wealth and became associated with elite beauty practices. For those who couldn't afford elaborate milk baths or expensive imported cosmetics, homemade preparations sufficed. Pliny the Elder and other writers recorded recipes that included barley flour, egg whites, honey, and various resins. These were less toxic than lead-based products and probably had some real moisturizing benefits from the natural oils and proteins they contained. But pale skin alone wasn't enough. The whitening agents created such an artificial appearance that additional colour needed to be added back to look lively rather than corpse-like. This is where rouge came in. Romans applied red colouring to their cheeks to create a healthy flush. The sources of this red pigment were varied and sometimes disturbing. Some rouge was made from red ochre or hematite, mineral sources that were relatively safe. But other formulations used more exotic ingredients. One popular source of red colour was crocodile dung. Yes, crocodile feces. Whether this actually provided better colour than mineral sources or whether it was simply exotic and therefore prestigious is unclear. Other recipes called for wine dregs, mulberry juice, rose petals, or poppy petals. Some women used red lead, which had the same toxicity problems as white lead, but added in a cheerful rosy hue. The eyes received special attention. Roman women lined their eyelids and darkened their eyebrows with kohl, a dark powder made from soot or antimony. The application required skill. Too much, and you looked garish. Too little, and the effect was lost. The kohl was applied with thin sticks made from wood, bone, or ivory, which were first moistened with water or perfumed oil. Eyeshadow added additional colour. Green shadow came from malachite, a copper carbonate mineral that is, unfortunately, toxic. Blue shadow came from azurite, another copper mineral. Romans had no idea these substances were poisonous. They just knew they created pretty colours that made eyes look larger and more dramatic. Lips were tinted with various red substances, possibly including ochre, wine stains, or crushed mulberries. The exact formulations are difficult to reconstruct from ancient sources, but it's clear that coloured lips were part of the ideal Roman look, at least for women who could afford cosmetics. Now let's address body hair, which occupied an enormous amount of attention in Roman grooming culture. For women, any body hair except on the head was considered repulsive. For men, the situation was more nuanced. Too much hair was barbaric and unrefined. Too little hair was effeminate and weak. Men were supposed to find the perfect middle ground of masculine grooming. Hair removal methods ranged from simple plucking to elaborate and painful procedures. Tweezers were common, used to pluck individual hairs from eyebrows, cheeks, or anywhere else unwanted hair appeared. Some wealthy Romans employed specialized slaves whose sole job was plucking hair. These armpit pluckers were mentioned in ancient sources, suggesting that armpit hair removal was expected even for men. For larger areas, other methods were necessary. Some Romans shaved with razors made from bronze or iron. These weren't the carefully honed, sharp blades we imagine. Ancient razors were crude by modern standards, and shaving with them would have been painful and likely to cause cuts and irritation. More commonly, Romans used depilatory methods. Resin or wax-based pastes were spread on the skin and then ripped off, taking the hair with them in a process basically identical to modern waxing. This was painful then, just as it is now. Other depilatory pastes contained various herbs and chemicals meant to dissolve or weaken the hair. The effectiveness varied, and the chemical formulation sometimes burned or irritated the skin. Pumice stones offered another option. The abrasive volcanic rock could be rubbed over the skin to literally scrape away hair and the top layer of skin with it. This left the skin smooth but raw, and required follow-up treatment with oils or balms to soothe the irritation. After hair removal, various ointments were applied. These supposedly prevented hair regrowth or softened the skin. Ingredients ranged from relatively benign substances like plant extracts to genuinely weird materials like the innards of sea creatures, crushed frogs, or leech paste. Whether any of these actually inhibited hair growth is doubtful, but the practice was widespread. Hair on the head, by contrast, was cultivated obsessively. Hairstyles were incredibly important social markers. Women's hairstyles in particular changed dramatically across different periods of Roman history. During some eras, hair was piled high in elaborate constructions requiring hours of work and multiple slaves to achieve. Other periods favoured simpler styles. Following the latest fashion was essential for women who cared about their social standing. Hair dyeing was common. Blonde or red hair was especially prized, probably because it was less common among the Mediterranean population. To achieve these colours, Romans applied various concoctions including wood ash, lye, saffron and plant extracts. These early hair dyes could be left on overnight or rinsed out quickly, depending on the formula. They damaged hair, making it brittle and prone to breaking, but that was considered an acceptable price for fashionable colour. Some women wore wigs, either to achieve styles impossible with their own hair, or to cover baldness or hair loss resulting from chemical dyes and heat styling. These wigs were made from human hair, often taken from slaves or bought from traders who imported hair from distant provinces. Blonde hair from Germanic tribes or red hair from Celtic regions commanded premium prices. Men also cared about their hair, though they had to be careful not to appear too vain. During Emperor Commodus's reign, it became fashionable for men to dye their hair blonde, following the emperor's example. But men who paid too much attention to their appearance risked being labelled effeminate. The satirists had a field day mocking men who clearly dyed their hair or arranged their hair in elaborate styles. Hair curling was achieved using heated bronze rods, similar in principle to modern curling irons. These were heated in ashes from the fire and then used to shape the hair. The risk of burns was real, and many a Roman slave probably suffered burns while attempting to curl their mistress's or master's hair. After all the hair removal, makeup application, and hair styling came perfume. Romans loved perfume with an intensity that modern people might find excessive. They doused themselves in scented oils, perfumed their clothes and bed linens, and filled their rooms with incense and aromatic sachets. This wasn't just vanity, it was necessity. Without deodorant, without modern hygiene, without frequent clothes washing, body odour was a constant problem. Perfume masked these smells. Roman perfumes were oil-based rather than alcohol-based. Since the distillation techniques needed for alcohol-based perfumes hadn't been developed yet, the base oil was usually olive oil or almond oil, into which various aromatic substances were infused. Popular ingredients included rose, violet, lily, lavender, saffron, cardamom and myrrh. Expensive imported substances like frankincense and myrrh were highly valued. The perfume industry was sophisticated and profitable. Perfumers were skilled craftsmen who guarded their formulas. Different perfumes were considered appropriate for different occasions and different body parts. You might wear one scent on your hair, another on your face, and yet another on your body. The Romans believed that properly applied perfume was an art form. But not everyone approved of heavy perfume use. Stoic philosophers preached that virtue lay in natural simplicity and that excessive grooming revealed moral weakness. Seneca argued that a man should smell of smoke and oil from the baths, not of flowery unguents. This tension between cultural expectations of grooming and philosophical ideals of simplicity created interesting contradictions in Roman attitudes toward beauty. women faced particular scrutiny for their beauty practices. Satirists like Juvenal mocked women who spent hours on their appearance, suggesting that such vanity revealed moral failings. Male writers described the beauty routine as deceptive, a way for women to trick men into finding them attractive. Ovid, in his Beauty manual, specifically instructed women to hide their cosmetic practices from men, conducting their beauty rituals in private so that men would see only the finished result, never the process. This reveals interesting attitudes about gender and appearance in Rome. Men were supposed to be naturally appealing through their virtues and status. Women were expected to be beautiful, but also criticised for the work required to achieve that beauty. The ideal Roman woman appeared effortlessly lovely, even though achieving that appearance required hours of daily work and a small army of cosmetas slaves. The health consequences of these beauty practices were severe but poorly understood. Lead poisoning from cosmetics probably shortened many lives and caused infertility. Chemical burns from depilatory pastes damaged skin. Toxic eye makeup harmed vision. The irony is that Roman beauty practices, meant to preserve and enhance appearance, often damaged health and accelerated aging. Women who survived into their 40s after decades of applying lead makeup would have shown visible signs of chronic lead poisoning even as they continued using the same products to try to maintain their looks. The archaeological evidence for Roman cosmetics is extensive. Graves have been found containing complete cosmetic kits with mirrors, applicators, containers of various substances, and even preserved residues of ancient makeup. Chemical analysis of these residues confirms what the literary sources tell us. Romans really did use lead, mercury, and other toxic substances in pursuit of beauty. One particularly complete grave was discovered in Germany in 2019. The burial contained a wealthy Roman woman from the 4th century AD along with her cosmetic tools. The grave included glass perfume vials, a bronze oil jar, a silver hand mirror, a slate makeup palette with application tools, hairpins, and even a finely carved folding knife with a Hercules figurine as decoration. This woman literally took her beauty routine to the grave, buried with all the tools she needed to maintain her appearance in the afterlife. Modern recreations of Roman cosmetics using ancient recipes have demonstrated both the effectiveness and the dangers of these products. Lead-based foundation really does create a smooth, pale finish. Kohl really does make eyes look larger and more dramatic. Urine-based hair treatments really do lighten hair colour. The Romans weren't stupid. Their beauty products worked. They just also happened to be poisoning users in ways that wouldn't be understood for another 1500 years. If you thought Roman bathing practices were questionable, wait until you learn about their laundry. The Romans took their clothing seriously. Even the poor wore clean tunics when they appeared in public. Appearance mattered, and wearing soiled, stained clothing was social suicide. But getting clothes clean in a world without detergent, without washing machines, without even soap in common use, required creative solutions. The Romans found one, and it involved massive quantities of urine. The profession of fuller, or fullo in Latin, was both essential and somewhat disreputable. Fullers operated establishments called fullonici, which were part laundromat, part textile finishing facility, and part public nuisance due to the overwhelming smell. These shops existed throughout Rome and across the empire. The remains of several fullonici have been excavated at Pompeii, providing detailed evidence of how they operated. A typical fullonica was built around large stone basins and smaller treading stools. The floor plan often resembled a converted home because many fullonica were exactly that, residential buildings adapted for commercial use. The fullonica of Stephanus in Pompeii is a perfect example. Originally a house with an atrium and peristyle, it was converted into a fullery shortly after the earthquake of 62 AD, which destroyed much of the city a decade and a half before Vesuvius finished the job. The cleaning process began with urine. Not just any urine, but aged, stale urine that had been allowed to ferment. Fresh urine wouldn't work. The active cleaning agent was ammonia, and ammonia only develops as urine decomposes, so fullers needed a constant supply of stale urine, and they got it through a system that would seem bizarre to modern sensibilities. Large ceramic jars were placed at street corners throughout the city. These weren't decorative urns. They were public urinals, and men were encouraged to relieve themselves into these vessels instead of, presumably, the alternative of using the street itself. The jars would be collected periodically by fullers or their agents, who would transport the urine back to the fullonica. This urine collection was so important to the Roman economy that Emperor Vespasian decided to tax it. The vectigal urinae, or urine tax, was levied on the fullers who collected and used the urine. This led to the famous exchange with Vespasian's son Titus, who complained about the indignity of taxing something so base. Vespasian's response, pecunia non olet, money doesn't smell, became proverbial. The tax remained in place and provided steady revenue to the imperial treasury. Once the fullers had their urine, the actual cleaning could begin. Dirty clothing was placed in large vats filled with a mixture of water and urine. Then workers, often slaves, would climb into these vats and stomp on the clothes, agitating them in the liquid. This process was called saltus fullonicus, or the fuller's jump. It was hard, physical work, and the workers had to do it barefoot, standing in urine-soaked wool for hours. The stomping served several purposes. It worked the liquid through the fibres of the cloth, allowing the ammonia to break down oils and stains. The mechanical action helped loosen dirt and grime. The process was essentially a human-powered washing machine, using feet instead of rotating drums, but achieving similar results through agitation. After the initial washing, the clothes were rinsed in clean water. Multiple rinsing basins allowed fullers to progressively clean away the urine and dissolve dirt. Some fullonicae were connected to the aqueduct system, providing a supply of running water for this purpose. Others relied on wells or had water delivered. The wet clothes were then hung to dry, often in an upper-story drying room or outside if weather permitted. Once dry, they needed finishing. This involved brushing the fabric with thistles or thorns to raise the nap, creating a softer texture. For wool garments, this also helped the fabric felt slightly, making it tighter and more water-resistant. For white garments, there was an additional bleaching step. Clothes were placed in a dome-shaped cage made of wicker or wood and fumigated with sulphur. The sulphur fumes had a bleaching effect, making white togas brilliantly white. This is why wealthy Romans' togas were so dazzlingly bright in public appearances. The sulphur treatment, applied regularly, kept them looking new. But there was another substance fullers used alongside urine, fuller's earth. This was a type of clay with excellent absorptive properties. It could soak up oils, stains, and other substances that urine alone couldn't remove. Fuller's earth was applied to clothing as a paste, allowed to dry and then brushed off, taking the absorbed dirt with it. This substance is still used in various industrial processes today, including cosmetics manufacturing. The effectiveness of these cleaning methods is actually well documented. Modern recreations using ancient techniques have demonstrated that urine and fuller's earth really do clean cloth effectively. The ammonia in aged urine is a powerful degreaser and stain remover. Combined with mechanical agitation and the absorptive power of fuller's earth, the process could restore even heavily soiled clothing to a wearable condition. But the process was also disgusting and aromatic in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate from a distance of 2,000 years. The smell of a fullonica must have been overwhelming. Stale urine has a sharp, acrid odour that doesn't dissipate easily. Multiply that by the hundreds of gallons used daily in a busy fullonica, add in the smell of wet wool, sulphur fumes and working bodies, and you have an establishment that no one wanted to live near. Ancient sources confirm this. Fullers were often the subject of jokes and insults based on their association with urine and stench. The Roman statesman Cicero was mocked by his political enemies as being the son of a fuller, which was meant to be insulting. The implication was that he came from low origins among people who worked with waste. Yet fullers were also relatively prosperous. Cleaning clothes and finishing new textiles was essential work that people were willing to pay for. The Phallonica of Stephanus in Pompeii was clearly a successful operation, large enough to require multiple workers and expensive enough to construct to represent a significant investment. Fullers formed their own professional association, a collegium, and dedicated statues to prominent citizens. They worshipped the goddess Minerva, who was patroness of craftsmen and workers. The profession wasn't just about cleaning worn clothing. Fullers also processed new cloth fresh from the loom. Woven fabric needed to be washed to remove oils used in the weaving process, shrunk slightly to tighten the weave, and sometimes dyed. The finishing of new textiles was actually more lucrative than cleaning old clothes, though most Phallonica did both. There were different grades of Phallonica, just as there are different grades of dry cleaners today. Elite establishments catered to wealthy clients, cleaning expensive garments with special care and charging premium prices. Neighbourhood Phallonica served local residents with standard washing services. The quality of the work varied, and just like today, there were complaints about lost clothing, damaged garments, and clothes being returned to the wrong customer. Roman law addressed these problems. Fullers could be sued if they lost or damaged clothing entrusted to them. They could also be held liable if they returned the wrong garments to customers. The legal code treated fullers as professionals with specific responsibilities, suggesting that disputes over laundry were common enough to require formal legal frameworks for resolution. Not everyone used professional fullers. The wealthy had slaves who could wash clothes at home, though even wealthy households sometimes sent special garments out for professional cleaning. The truly poor probably washed their own limited clothing as best they could, unable to afford professional services. But for the middle ranks of society, fullers were essential. A working Roman needed clean clothing to maintain their respectability. Your tunic was often your only garment, or at least your only good garment. Keeping it clean meant maintaining your place in society. It meant being seen as a civilized person rather than a barbarian or a destitute beggar. So Romans paid the fullers, held their noses against the smell, and accepted that this was the price of civilization. The technology of laundry didn't change significantly for more than 1,000 years after the fall of Rome. Medieval Europeans continued using similar techniques, including urine, well into the Renaissance period. Soap eventually replaced urine as the primary cleaning agent, but the basic process of soaking, agitating, rinsing, and drying remained essentially the same until the Industrial Revolution mechanized laundry in the 19th century. The fuller's trade in ancient Rome demonstrates something important about how civilization solved practical problems. The Romans needed clean clothes. They didn't have the chemistry to produce synthetic detergents. They didn't have the engineering to build mechanical washing machines. But they did have urine, which was free and abundant, and they figured out how to use it effectively. The solution was unpleasant but functional. It met the needs of Roman society using available resources and available technology. That's what Roman hygiene looked like in practice. Not always pretty, not always what we'd choose today, but effective enough given the constraints of their world. If there's one achievement of Roman engineering that truly deserves the admiration it receives, it's the aqueduct system. These structures, striding across valleys on multiple levels of stone arches, bringing water from distant springs and rivers into the heart of cities, represent Roman engineering at its finest. But as impressive as the aqueducts were architecturally, their impact on public health was once again more complicated than a simple narrative of progress would suggest. By the height of the empire, Rome was supplied by 11 major aqueducts, bringing water from sources as far as 57 miles away. The total length of these aqueducts, if you measured every mile of channel including underground sections, exceeded 260 miles. Most of this distance was underground, but the visible sections, the arch bridges carrying water across valleys, were the parts that captured public imagination then and now. The oldest aqueduct was the Aqua Appia, built in 312 BC under the censor Appius Claudius Caecus, the same man who built the Appian Way. The Aqua Appia was almost entirely underground, making it less vulnerable to attack by enemies, which was an important consideration during Rome's wars of expansion. Later aqueducts became progressively more elaborate and visible. The Aqua Claudia and the Annia Novus, both completed under Emperor Claudius in 52 AD, were particularly impressive. The Aqua Claudia stretched for 43 miles and brought exceptionally high-quality water from springs in the mountains. Parts of this aqueduct still stand today, their arches marching across the Roman countryside as testimony to ancient engineering skill. The actual construction of these aqueducts required sophisticated surveying techniques. The water channel had to maintain a steady, gentle gradient from source to destination. Too steep, and water would flow too fast, eroding the channel and causing maintenance problems. Too shallow, and water would barely flow at all. Roman engineers calculated these gradients using simple surveying tools called chorobates and groma, achieving remarkable precision despite their primitive instruments. The water channels themselves were usually made of stone or concrete, lined with waterproof plaster. The Romans developed a special hydraulic concrete that could set underwater, allowing them to build structures in rivers and streams. This concrete used a volcanic ash called pozzolana mixed with lime, creating a material that was remarkably durable. Many Roman concrete structures are still standing, 2,000 years later, sometimes in better condition than structures built with modern materials. Where aqueducts had to cross valleys, Roman engineers had several options. The most visually dramatic was the arcade bridge, with multiple levels of arches supporting a water channel at the top. The Pont de Gard in southern France is perhaps the most famous example, rising 160 feet above the river below with 3 levels of arches. But arcades were expensive and time-consuming to build, so they were used only when necessary. An alternative method was the siphon. In this technique, water would flow down into a valley through pressurized pipes, then up the other side. The pressure of the water column pushing down from the height on one side would force water up the slope on the other side, allowing it to reach a destination nearly as high as its source. This required strong pipes capable of withstanding significant water pressure. Romans used lead, terracotta, or occasionally stone pipes for siphons, often encasing them in concrete for additional strength. Inside the city, water was distributed through a system of distribution tanks called castella. These large reservoirs served as buffer storage and distribution points. From the castella, smaller pipes carried water to public fountains, baths, toilets, and some private homes. The system was designed to prioritize different uses. The highest quality water went to drinking fountains. Medium quality water supplied the baths. Lower quality water flushed the sewers. The water commissioner Frontinus, appointed by Emperor Nerva in 97 AD, wrote a detailed treatise describing the Roman water system. His work provides invaluable information about how the system functioned, including problems with corruption and illegal tapping of water supplies. Frontinus discovered that many people had illegally connected pipes to the aqueducts, stealing water that should have flowed to public facilities. Some watermen who maintained the system were corrupt, taking bribes to install unauthorized connections. Despite these management problems, the volume of water flowing into Rome was staggering. Modern estimates suggest that at peak capacity, the 11 aqueducts could deliver about 300 million gallons of water daily to a population of roughly 1 million people. That's about 300 gallons per person per day, comparable to or exceeding modern consumption in many developed countries. But here's a crucial question. Did all this water actually make Romans healthier? The answer is nuanced. Yes, having abundant clean water from mountain springs was better than relying solely on the polluted Tiber River. Yes, the ability to supply public fountains throughout the city meant that even poor Romans could access clean drinking water. And yes, the water supply enabled the bath system and toilet facilities that Romans valued. However, the system wasn't as clean as it appeared. Recent archaeological and epidemiological studies have revealed some troubling facts. The network of lead pipes used to distribute water almost certainly contributed to chronic lead poisoning across the Roman population. Analysis of skeletal remains shows elevated lead levels, particularly in urban populations served by lead plumbing. Romans knew lead was toxic in high doses, but they didn't understand that chronic low-level exposure was also harmful. They assumed that the flow of water through lead pipes was too brief to cause contamination. They were wrong. Modern testing has shown that water flowing through lead pipes does absorb lead, especially if the water is slightly acidic. Roman water, coming from various sources with different mineral contents, varied in its acidity, but some sources would have been perfect for dissolving lead. The health effects of lead poisoning are serious: anemia, kidney damage, nervous system damage, cognitive impairment, and reproductive problems. Some historians have even suggested that widespread lead poisoning might have contributed to the decline of the Roman Empire, though this theory is controversial and probably overstated. Lead poisoning was a problem, but not the only problem, or even the primary problem facing Roman society. The aqueducts also created new environmental problems. To supply Rome with water, distant watersheds were diverted. Springs that had fed local ecosystems were captured and redirected. The impact on local wildlife and plant life around these diversion points was probably significant, though ancient sources don't discuss such ecological concerns. Inside the city, the constant flow of water created artificial conditions that favoured certain diseases and parasites. The standing water in fountain basins and public water tanks provided breeding sites for mosquitoes, including species that could carry malaria. While malaria was present in Italy before the Romans, the water system may have increased transmission by creating more habitat for mosquito larvae close to human populations. The system also required constant maintenance. A dedicated workforce of slaves and free workers patrolled the aqueducts, repairing damage, clearing obstructions, and preventing illegal tapping. In winter, pipes could freeze and burst. In summer, algae could grow in the channels. Earthquakes could damage the massive stone structures. Enemy armies, recognizing the strategic importance of the water supply, regularly targeted aqueducts during sieges. During the Gothic siege of Rome in 537 AD, the Goths cut the aqueducts in an attempt to force the city to surrender. Without water, the baths closed, the fountains ran dry, and the sewers stopped flowing. The Roman general Belisarius had to block the aqueduct channels from inside the city to prevent enemies from entering through them. This demonstrated how dependent Rome had become on its water infrastructure. When it failed, even temporarily, the entire city ground to a halt. The quality of water varied between different aqueducts. The Aqua Marcia was famous for delivering exceptionally pure cold water that was highly prized for drinking. The Aqua Alsiatina, by contrast, brought water that was considered non-potable, suitable only for watering gardens and for the Naumachia, artificial lakes used for staging mock naval battles. Romans could taste the difference between waters from different sources, and they had preferences. Frontinus noted that some Romans would pay premium prices to have water from specific aqueducts delivered to their homes. This suggests a level of sophistication in understanding water quality that went beyond simple quantity. The aqueduct system spread across the empire wherever Romans settled. Segovia in Spain, Lyon in France, and numerous cities in North Africa and the Middle East received impressive aqueduct systems. Many of these structures still stand, either as ruins or in some cases as functioning water supplies that have been updated with modern materials while retaining the ancient channels. The Segovia aqueduct in Spain, built around 98 AD, is particularly remarkable because it's constructed without mortar. Huge granite blocks are held together by precise fitting and gravity alone. This structure is still standing, still impressive, and served as part of Segovia's water supply into the 20th century. The engineering knowledge required to build these aqueducts was transmitted through the writings of Vitruvius and Frontinus, through practical apprenticeship of engineers and workers, and through the standardization of techniques across the empire. When the Western Roman Empire fell, much of this knowledge was lost. Medieval Europeans lacked the organisational capacity and engineering skill to build such massive water projects. Urban water supplies declined, and the carefully managed systems of the Romans were replaced by simpler, less reliable methods. It wasn't until the Renaissance and the early modern period that European cities began rebuilding water supply systems on a scale comparable to Roman aqueducts. Many early modern aqueducts explicitly copied Roman designs or even reused Roman structures, as happened in Rome itself, where several ancient aqueducts were restored and put back into service during the 16th and 17th centuries. The Roman aqueduct system represents both the heights of ancient engineering and the limitations of ancient medicine. The Romans built magnificent structures that brought enormous quantities of clean water into their cities, genuinely improving quality of life and enabling urban development on a scale not seen again for more than 1,000 years. But their inability to understand disease transmission, their use of toxic materials like lead, and their creation of environments favourable to disease vectors meant that the health benefits were less than they should have been. Here's where we need to confront an uncomfortable truth about Roman hygiene. Despite all their baths, aqueducts, sewers, and grooming rituals, Romans were crawling with parasites and plagued by diseases. Archaeological evidence paints a picture that contradicts our image of the Romans as a clean, healthy people. Modern analysis of Roman skeletal remains, fossilised feces called coprolites, and soil samples from ancient Roman sites reveals high rates of parasitic infection, chronic disease, and life-threatening illnesses. Let's start with the most prevalent and persistent problem: intestinal parasites. Analysis of Roman coprolites in ancient toilets has found eggs from whipworm, roundworm, and other intestinal parasites in abundance. These parasites weren't just present, they were endemic. Studies comparing Roman-era populations with pre-Roman Iron Age populations in the same regions have found that parasitic infection rates actually increased during the Roman period, despite all the supposed improvements in sanitation. Whipworm, or Trichuris trichura, was particularly common. This parasite lives in the large intestine, feeding on blood and causing chronic diarrhea, abdominal pain, and anemia. Heavy infections can lead to prolapsed rectum and stunted growth in children. The parasite spreads through fecal-oral contamination, which sounds like something that should be preventable with good sanitation, except that Roman sanitation practices inadvertently made transmission easier. Remember that shared sponge on a stick used in public latrines? Perfect for spreading whipworm eggs. Remember the practice of using human feces as fertilizer in vegetable gardens? Perfect for contaminating food with parasite eggs. Remember those public baths where people soaked in unchanged water? Perfect for transmitting parasites and other pathogens. Roundworm, or Ascaris lumbricoides, was another common parasite. This one can grow quite large, sometimes reaching a foot in length, and it lives in the small intestine. Infected people often pass several worms at once, and ancient medical texts describe this happening, though doctors at the time attributed it to spontaneous generation rather than understanding that these were parasites with complex life cycles. The dysentery-causing amoeba Entamoeba histolytica was also widespread. This single-celled parasite causes severe, bloody diarrhea and can invade the intestinal wall, causing ulcers and even spreading to the liver. In an era before antibiotics and antiparasitic medications, a serious case of amoebic dysentery could easily be fatal. But here's what's particularly interesting and somewhat damning for Roman sanitation. Fish tapeworm, or Diphyllobothrium latum, became more common during the Roman period than it had been before. This parasite requires a complex life cycle involving fish, usually freshwater fish. The Romans' love of fermented, uncooked fish sauce called garum probably spread this parasite across the empire. Garum was made by fermenting fish in salt, and if the fish weren't properly salted or if the fermentation process didn't kill the parasite larvae, consuming garum could lead to infection. Fish tapeworm can grow to enormous lengths in the human intestine. sometimes reaching 30 feet or more. The parasite competes with its host for nutrients, particularly vitamin B12, leading to anemia and nutritional deficiencies. The spread of this parasite through garum represents a fascinating case of a food preservation and trade practice inadvertently becoming a disease vector. Now let's talk about ectoparasites, the creatures that live on the outside of the body rather than inside. Lice were absolutely endemic in Roman society. Head lice, body lice, and pubic lice all thrived in conditions where people lived in close quarters, changed clothes infrequently, and had limited ability to thoroughly clean fabrics. Archaeological sites have yielded numerous examples of combs specially designed for removing lice from hair. These combs had very fine teeth, perfect for catching and removing both adult lice and their eggs, called nits. The presence of these combs at sites across the Roman Empire in both wealthy and poor contexts tells us that lice infestation crossed all social boundaries. Everyone had lice, from slaves to emperors. Body lice were particularly problematic because they can carry diseases, specifically epidemic typhus and trench fever. These diseases were likely present in the Roman world, though the ancient sources don't describe them clearly enough for us to be certain. What we do know is that lice were so common that delousing was probably a daily activity for many Romans. The Romans' much vaunted bathing culture didn't eliminate lice. In fact, research suggests that bathing in communal baths might have facilitated the spread of lice from person to person. Lice can survive in water for extended periods, and the warm, humid environment of Roman baths would have been perfect for lice transmission. Bedbugs were another common pest. These blood-feeding insects hide in cracks and crevices during the day and emerge at night to feed on sleeping humans. Roman beds, constructed of wood and fabric, provided perfect habitat. The bites are intensely itchy and can disrupt sleep, and heavy infestations can lead to anemia and secondary infections from scratching. Fleas were also widespread. With the prevalence of rats in urban areas and the common practice of keeping dogs and other animals in close proximity to living spaces, fleas would have been constant companions for most Romans. Some flea species can transmit diseases, including plague, though whether plague was present in Rome during the empire's peak is debated. Now, we need to discuss the major epidemics that struck the Roman Empire. The most significant was the Antonine Plague, which ravaged the empire from approximately 165 to 180 AD. This epidemic, likely smallpox, though some historians argue it might have been measles, was brought back to Rome by soldiers returning from campaigns into the east. The disease spread rapidly through the densely populated cities of the empire. Contemporary accounts describe horrific symptoms: fever, chills, diarrhea that turned from red to black, and terrible pustules that covered the entire body, inside and out. The mortality rate was high, perhaps 10% or more of the population. The physician Galen witnessed the epidemic in Rome and wrote about it, though his descriptions are sometimes difficult to interpret from a modern medical perspective. The Antonine Plague may have killed as many as 5 million people across the empire. It struck again in 189 AD, with reports of 2,000 deaths daily in Rome during the peak of the outbreak. The social and economic impact was severe. Labour shortages affected agriculture and industry. The army was weakened. Some historians argue that the plague was a turning point, marking the beginning of Rome's decline, though this is debated. The psychological impact of such a devastating epidemic cannot be overstated. Romans suddenly faced a disease that killed massively, gruesomely and seemingly at random. People turned to religion, to magic, to amulets and prayers. Archaeologists have found carved stones and inscriptions from this period specifically meant to ward off plague. Malaria was another serious disease in Roman Italy. The Plasmodium parasite, transmitted by mosquitoes, causes cyclical fevers, chills, and can be fatal if untreated. Malaria was particularly prevalent in low-lying marshy areas around Rome. Recent DNA analysis of Roman-era skeletal remains has confirmed the presence of Plasmodium falciparum, the most dangerous malaria species in ancient Italy. Malaria shaped Roman history in important ways. Certain areas were known as particularly unhealthy and were avoided when possible. The drainage of marshes, one of Rome's major public works projects, was partly motivated by the desire to reduce the bad air, malaria in Italian, from which we get the word malaria, that was associated with swampy areas. The Romans didn't understand that mosquitoes were the disease vector, but they correctly observed that marshy areas were unhealthy. Tuberculosis was endemic in the Roman world. This bacterial infection most commonly affects the lungs, but can spread to other parts of the body, including the spine. Skeletal remains from Pompeii and other sites show evidence of tuberculosis infections, including the characteristic damage to vertebrae known as Pott's disease. TB spreads through coughing and close contact, so the crowded living conditions in Roman cities would have facilitated transmission. Waterborne diseases like cholera and typhoid fever were likely common, though ancient descriptions don't allow us to definitively identify specific diseases. The Romans' water supply system was good compared to most ancient civilizations, but it wasn't perfect. Contamination could occur at various points in the distribution system, and the recycling of bath water and the use of communal toilet facilities provided perfect conditions for waterborne pathogen transmission. Brucellosis, a bacterial disease contracted from contaminated meat or dairy products, has been identified in Roman-era skeletons through DNA analysis. This disease causes chronic fatigue, joint pain, and fever. Romans consumed dairy products from various animals, and if the milk or cheese wasn't properly prepared, brucellosis transmission was possible. Interestingly, some diseases that we might expect to find seem to have been less common. Cancer, while definitely present, appears in Roman remains at lower rates than in modern populations. This is probably due to shorter lifespans rather than lower cancer rates, since most cancers develop later in life. Romans simply didn't live long enough for many cancers to develop. The overall picture that emerges from this disease evidence is sobering. Despite their engineering marvels, despite their bathing culture, despite their attempts at sanitation, Romans lived in an environment rife with disease. Life expectancy was low, perhaps in the mid-20s at birth, though this figure is heavily skewed by high infant mortality. If you survived childhood, you might live into your 40s or 50s, but you'd probably be plagued by chronic parasitic infections, you'd suffer through multiple epidemic diseases, and you'd live with pain and illness that modern medicine could easily treat. The Romans' inability to understand disease causation meant that their sanitation measures, however impressive from an engineering standpoint, often missed the mark from a public health perspective. They built elaborate systems to remove waste from sight and smell, not realizing they needed to interrupt specific transmission pathways to prevent disease. They bathed constantly, not understanding that shared water was itself a disease risk. They believed disease came from bad air or imbalances in bodily humours, so they focused on interventions that, from a modern perspective, were sometimes counterproductive. This doesn't diminish the achievement of Roman engineering. Building aqueducts, sewers, and public baths was genuinely impressive, but we need to be honest about the limitations of these systems and the health outcomes they produced. Roman hygiene was advanced for its time, but still left most people vulnerable to diseases and parasites that would be easily prevented or treated today. To understand why Roman hygiene practices were simultaneously sophisticated and ineffective, we need to understand Roman medicine. The Romans inherited their medical framework from the Greeks, particularly from the writings of Hippocrates and the later work of Galen. This framework was philosophically complex and internally consistent, but it was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how the human body and disease actually work. The core of Roman medical theory was the concept of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was believed to result from these humours being in proper balance. Disease occurred when the humours became imbalanced. Each humour was associated with specific qualities, elements, seasons, and even personality types. Blood was hot and wet like air and spring. Phlegm was cold and wet like water and winter. Yellow bile was hot and dry like fire and summer. Black bile was cold and dry like earth and autumn. This wasn't just abstract philosophy. It had practical implications for how doctors treated disease. If someone had a fever which was associated with too much blood, the treatment was bloodletting, removing excess blood to restore balance. If someone was suffering from too much phlegm, which caused colds and respiratory problems, treatments focused on drying and warming the body. The physician Galen, who lived from 130 to 210 AD, became the most influential medical authority in the Roman world and remained so for more than 1,000 years after Rome fell. Galen was a skilled anatomist who learned his craft treating wounded gladiators and dissecting animals. He made genuine advances in understanding anatomy and physiology. He correctly identified that arteries carry blood, not air, as had been previously believed. He understood that the brain controlled the body through nerves. He recognized that damage to different parts of the brain caused different functional impairments. But Galen also perpetuated errors that would confuse medicine for centuries. He believed that disease could be treated by adjusting the balance of humours through diet, bloodletting, purging, and various medications. He thought that different parts of the body produced different humours, with the liver making blood, the brain making phlegm, the spleen making black bile, and the gallbladder making yellow bile. This theory had practical implications for hygiene. Romans believed that bathing helped maintain humoral balance by opening the pores and allowing excess humours to escape through the skin. They thought that certain foods would increase or decrease specific humours. Wine, being hot and wet, would increase blood. Garlic, being hot and dry, would increase yellow bile. This is why diet was considered such an important part of maintaining health. The theory also explained, to Roman satisfaction, why disease seemed to strike randomly. If disease was caused by humoral imbalance, and if imbalances could result from diet, climate, emotions, or individual constitution, then anyone might become sick at any time depending on their unique circumstances. This fit with Romans' observations better than believing disease had specific, consistent causes. Romans did recognise that some diseases seemed to be contagious, passing from person to person. But they didn't understand the mechanism. The dominant theory was that disease spread through miasma, bad air carrying disease-causing influences. This is why Romans were concerned about foul smells and associated swamps and sewers with disease. They weren't completely wrong. Many disease vectors do concentrate in such areas, but they misunderstood the causation. This miasma theory had implications for hygiene practices. It encouraged Romans to avoid bad smells and to remove waste from living areas, which were positive behaviours even if the reasoning was incorrect. But it also meant they didn't understand person-to-person transmission through contact, shared objects, or contaminated water and food. Medical treatments reflected this theoretical framework. Bloodletting was extremely common. Doctors would make cuts in veins and allow blood to flow out, sometimes collecting it in measured containers to ensure the right amount was removed. Alternatively, they used leeches, which would attach to the skin and draw blood. The practice was based on the theory that excess blood caused many ailments, so removing blood would restore balance. Purging and vomiting were also routine medical interventions. If someone had too much bile or phlegm, doctors would administer drugs to induce vomiting or diarrhea, forcibly expelling the excess humours. The medications used were often violent in their effects, causing severe gastric distress. This was considered therapeutic. Surgery was practiced, though it was dangerous and painful. Roman surgeons developed impressive tools, including scalpels, forceps probes, and even primitive specula for examining body cavities. They could perform amputations, remove bladder stones, repair hernias, and conduct various other operations. But without anaesthesia beyond alcohol and maybe some opium if you were lucky, and without any understanding of infection, surgical outcomes were poor by modern standards. The connection between hygiene and medicine was indirect in Roman thinking. They didn't believe that washing with soap prevented disease by removing microorganisms. They believed that bathing maintained health by balancing the humours, opening pores, and generally keeping the body in a state of equilibrium. This belief was so strong that they continued bathing even when doctors like Celsus warned that going to the baths with open wounds was dangerous. Romans also used numerous drugs and medications, many of which had real physiological effects even if the theoretical reasoning behind their use was flawed. Opium from poppies was used for pain relief. Willow bark, which contains salicylic acid, was used to reduce fever and pain. Various herbs were used as mild sedatives, digestive aids, and wound treatments. Some of these medications worked, at least partially. Honey, commonly used in wound dressings, actually has antimicrobial properties that modern medicine has rediscovered. Various plant extracts did have real pharmaceutical effects. The Romans stumbled on effective treatments through trial and error, even though their understanding of why these treatments worked was incorrect. But they also used medications that were useless or actively harmful. Therica, a complex mixture of dozens of ingredients including viper flesh, opium, and various herbs, was believed to be a universal antidote to poisons and a general health tonic. It probably had some minor effects from the opium content, but was otherwise inert. But Romans believed in it passionately, and expensive formulations of Therica were status symbols. The practice of medicine was not regulated in the modern sense. Anyone could claim to be a doctor. Some physicians were highly trained and came from respectable backgrounds. Others were simply charlatans selling fake cures and false hope. Wealthy Romans might have personal physicians, often educated Greek slaves or freedmen who had studied at medical schools in places like Alexandria or Pergamum. The poor went to whoever was available and affordable, or they relied on folk remedies passed down through families. Medical knowledge was transmitted through texts and apprenticeship. Aspiring doctors read Hippocrates and Galen, studied with established physicians, and learned by doing. Dissection of human cadavers was rare and controversial. So much anatomical knowledge came from animal dissection, which led to various errors when findings from animals were applied to humans. The Romans' approach to public health was pragmatic if theoretically flawed. They recognized that some environments were healthier than others. They knew that swamps caused disease. They knew that clean water was better than dirty water. They knew that removing waste from living areas was beneficial. They acted on this knowledge by building infrastructure to provide clean water and remove waste, even though they didn't understand the actual mechanisms of disease transmission. This pragmatic approach produced real benefits despite being based on incorrect theory. The aqueducts did bring cleaner water. The sewers did remove waste from immediate living areas. The baths did provide opportunities for cleaning that wouldn't have existed otherwise. But the lack of understanding about disease causation meant that these systems couldn't prevent disease as effectively as they might have with different design choices. Roman medical theory also influenced their approach to personal hygiene. The emphasis on balance and moderation affected how they thought about bathing, grooming, diet, and lifestyle. Excess in any direction was considered unhealthy. Too much bathing was as bad as too little. Too much rich food was dangerous. Too much wine caused problems. This emphasis on moderation probably had some positive effects, even if the underlying theory was wrong. The persistence of Roman medical theory long after Rome fell is remarkable. Galen's writings remained authoritative in Europe until the Renaissance and beyond. The theory of humours was still being taught in medical schools in the 17th century. It took the development of germ theory in the 19th century to finally overthrow the humoral framework that had dominated medicine for more than 2,000 years. Looking back, it's easy to criticise Roman medicine for its errors, but we should recognise that the Romans were trying to understand disease and health, using the observational tools and philosophical frameworks available to them. They lacked microscopes to see microorganisms. They lacked the scientific method as we understand it. They lacked centuries of accumulated empirical data. Given these limitations, the medical system they developed was sophisticated and internally consistent. It just happened to be based on incorrect premises about how disease actually works. Roman society was deeply stratified, and these social divisions profoundly affected access to hygiene practices and their consequences. The experience of hygiene in ancient Rome varied dramatically depending on whether you were rich or poor, free or enslaved, male or female, urban or rural. To understand Roman hygiene fully, we need to examine these divisions and their implications. Let's start with the fundamental divide between rich and poor. Wealthy Romans lived in spacious homes called domus, or countryside villas. These residences might have private bath suites with heated floors, private latrines, gardens with fountains, and even running water piped directly from the aqueduct system. The wealthiest families employed dozens or even hundreds of slaves who maintained these facilities and attended to their owners' personal hygiene. A wealthy Roman woman would wake to find slaves waiting to help her dress, style her hair, and apply cosmetics. She might have a dedicated cosmiste, a slave trained specifically in beauty treatments. She would bathe in her private bath suite using expensive imported soaps and perfumed oils. Her clothes would be cleaned by either household slaves or sent to professional fullers. She never had to worry about where her next bath would come from, or whether clean water was available. Contrast this with the experience of poor Romans, who constituted the majority of the urban population. Poor Romans lived in insulae, multi-storey apartment buildings that were often poorly constructed, overcrowded and lacking in basic amenities. These buildings rarely had running water above the ground floor. Residents had to fetch water from public fountains, carrying it up multiple flights of stairs. There were no private baths. The apartments had no latrines, forcing residents to use chamber pots or visit public facilities. For the poor, maintaining hygiene was a constant struggle. Water had to be carried, clothes had to be washed by hand or taken to fullers, which cost money. Bathing required going to public baths, which charged admission fees. While these fees were minimal, they still represented a real cost for people living at subsistence level. And the time spent going to the baths was time not spent earning money or doing other necessary tasks. The urban poor also lived in much dirtier environments. Their neighbourhoods were the ones where garbage accumulated in the streets, where waste was dumped from windows, where sewage leaked from poorly maintained pipes. The wealthy lived on hills like the Palatine, where better drainage and more resources for maintenance meant cleaner streets. The poor lived in low-lying areas prone to flooding and with worse sanitation infrastructure. Even within the free population there were gradations. The middling classes, merchants and craftspeople with moderate incomes had better access to hygiene than the poor, but couldn't match the luxury of the elite. They lived in modest houses or in the better quality insulae. They visited the public baths regularly and could afford to have their clothes professionally cleaned. But they didn't have private bath suites or squadrons of slaves to attend to their needs. Slaves occupied a different category entirely. Their hygiene depended entirely on their owners' choices. Slaves who worked in wealthy households were often well maintained because they reflected on their owners. They might bathe regularly using their owners' facilities or going to public baths. They wore clean clothing because their appearance mattered to their owners' social standing. But slaves who worked in agriculture, mining or other harsh conditions had minimal access to hygiene facilities. They wore whatever clothing they were given until it fell apart. They bathed when they could, which might not be often. They slept in cramped quarters with minimal comfort or privacy. Their health and hygiene were not priorities for their owners beyond what was necessary to keep them working. Female slaves faced additional vulnerabilities. Sexual exploitation was common and socially accepted. Female slaves had no legal right to refuse their owners' advances. This sexual exploitation would have had hygiene implications beyond the obvious emotional trauma. The risk of sexually transmitted diseases was real, though Romans had no effective treatments for conditions like gonorrhea or syphilis. Gender profoundly affected hygiene practices and expectations. Roman men and women lived in largely separate social worlds with different standards and different access to hygiene resources. Men dominated public space. They went to the forum, the baths, the theatres, and the taverns. Their hygiene practices were public and social. Men bathed together, exercised together, and maintained their grooming as part of their public persona. Women, particularly upper-class women, were expected to be more circumspect. They stayed home more often or travelled with attendants. Their hygiene routines were private, conducted in their own chambers, with only their female slaves present. The beautification process was elaborate but hidden. Men were supposed to see the results, never the process. This gender divide affected even basic things like toilet access. We've already discussed how public latrines were primarily male spaces. Women needed private alternatives which were available to the wealthy but not to the poor. Lower-class women faced genuine difficulties meeting basic hygienic needs in a city designed primarily for male convenience. Pregnancy and childbirth created additional hygiene challenges for women. Childbirth in ancient Rome was dangerous, with high mortality rates for both mothers and infants. The process was attended by midwives and female relatives, but rarely by trained physicians. The hygiene conditions during childbirth were poor by modern standards. No one understood the importance of clean hands or sterilised instruments. Post-birth infections were common and often fatal. Menstruation was another monthly hygiene challenge. Roman women used cloth pads or wool to absorb menstrual blood. These had to be washed and reused. For poor women without easy access to water and laundry facilities, managing menstruation hygienically would have been difficult. Ancient medical texts reveal that menstruation was viewed with some superstition. Pliny the Elder claimed that menstrual blood could sour wine, kill crops, and cause various other problems, reflecting broader anxieties about women's bodies. Children's hygiene experiences varied by age and social class. Infants and very young children were cared for by their mothers, or, in wealthy families, by wet nurses and nursemaids. They would have been bathed regularly as part of basic childcare. But once children reached working age, which could be as young as 6 or 7, they entered the adult world of labour and responsibility. Poor children worked alongside adults, doing whatever tasks their small size and limited strength allowed. Their hygiene practices would have been minimal. They wore hand-me-down clothing, bathed infrequently, and learned adult hygiene practices by observation. Children of the wealthy were better cared for but still faced childhood diseases at high rates due to the general disease environment. The elderly faced their own challenges. In a society with high mortality rates, relatively few people reached old age. Those who did often suffered from chronic conditions that made hygiene difficult. Arthritis made bathing painful. Weakened constitutions made them more vulnerable to cold water or to catching chills. Some became incontinent, creating additional hygiene challenges for themselves and their caregivers. Social class also determined the quality of medical care available when hygiene failures led to illness. The wealthy could afford personal physicians who, even if their treatments weren't always effective, at least paid attention to their patients' individual circumstances. The poor went to whoever was available and cheap, or they relied on folk remedies and prayers to the gods. Religious identity also affected hygiene practices to some degree. Jews living in the Roman Empire maintained their own hygiene traditions, including ritual washing and bathing requirements, distinct from general Roman practice. Christians, as the new religion spread through the empire, developed complicated attitudes toward bodily cleanliness. Some early Christian ascetics deliberately avoided bathing as a form of mortification, rejecting Roman bathing culture as too focused on bodily pleasure. Others maintained Roman hygiene practices while attending church services and practicing their faith. The intersection of class, gender, age, and social status created a complex landscape of hygiene access and practice. A wealthy woman had very different hygiene experiences than a poor man, who had different experiences than an enslaved child. But all of them lived within the same basic framework of Roman hygiene culture, using the same public facilities, following the same basic practices, and subject to the same diseases and parasites despite the differences in their daily experiences. This diversity of experience reminds us that speaking of Roman hygiene as a single thing is somewhat misleading. There were many Roman hygienes, many different ways of navigating the challenges of staying clean in an ancient city. What united Romans across these differences was not their actual practices, but rather their shared cultural values about cleanliness, their common use of certain public facilities, and their similar vulnerabilities to the diseases and health problems that plagued the ancient world. As we reach the end of our journey through Roman hygiene practices, it's worth stepping back and evaluating what the Romans achieved and where they fell short. This isn't about criticising people who lived 2,000 years ago for not having modern knowledge. Rather, it's about understanding what worked, what didn't, and what lessons we can draw from their experiences. The Romans got some things remarkably right. Their commitment to public infrastructure for water supply and waste removal was genuinely forward-thinking. Building aqueducts to bring clean water from distant sources showed an understanding that water quality mattered, even if they didn't fully understand why. The mere existence of public toilets, public baths, and sewers demonstrated a commitment to collective hygiene that many societies lacked. The scale of their ambition was impressive. The 11 aqueducts serving Rome moved millions of gallons of water daily. The sewer system, for all its flaws, represented a coordinated effort to manage waste in a city of 1 million people. The baths provided facilities that made regular bathing possible for ordinary citizens. This infrastructure represented massive investments of resources and labour, undertaken because Romans believed public health was a legitimate concern for government. Their bathing culture, despite the disease transmission problems we've discussed, did provide real benefits. Regular washing, even in imperfect conditions, is better than not washing at all. The social aspect of the baths created community bonds and reinforced cleanliness as a shared value. Romans smelled better and felt better because they bathed regularly, even if their bathing practices weren't as hygienic as they believed. The Romans' grooming practices, while sometimes toxic, reflected an understanding that personal appearance mattered for social functioning. Their dental hygiene, strange as it was, probably contributed to their relatively good dental health, along with their low-sugar diet. Their laundry practices, urine notwithstanding, did produce clean clothing, which was better than wearing dirty clothes continuously. But the Romans also got many things badly wrong, and these failures offer important lessons. Their most fundamental error was not understanding disease causation. Without germ theory, they couldn't design effective public health interventions. They built impressive infrastructure based on incorrect assumptions about how disease spreads. This meant that their sanitation systems, while architecturally impressive, were less effective at protecting health than they should have been. The shared toilet sponge stands as a perfect example of this problem. Romans thought they were maintaining cleanliness with this system. In reality, they were creating an efficient disease transmission pathway. They had the means to prevent this. They could have required individual wiping materials, but they didn't understand why it would matter. Similarly, the recycling of bathwater seemed economical and practical, but created perfect conditions for pathogen transmission. The use of lead pipes poisoned the population in ways Romans couldn't detect. The application of lead-based cosmetics caused chronic poisoning that shortened lives and damaged health. These weren't evil choices or stupid decisions. They were rational actions based on incomplete knowledge. The Romans' failure to separate water supplies from sewage disposal was another critical error. The Cloaca Maxima emptied into the Tiber, which was also used as a water source. This created a disease cycle that undermined the benefits of the aqueduct system. With better understanding of waterborne disease transmission, this could have been avoided or at least minimized. From a modern public health perspective, the Romans' achievements look different than they did to the Romans themselves. Yes, they built impressive infrastructure, but that infrastructure was most effective at making cities livable and functional, rather than at preventing disease. The aqueducts supplied water for drinking, bathing, industry, and entertainment. The sewers kept streets from being completely impassable. These were important accomplishments that enabled urbanization on an unprecedented scale. But from an epidemiological standpoint, Roman cities were disease factories. The dense population, the communal facilities, the interconnected water and sewer systems, and the lack of understanding about disease transmission created perfect conditions for pathogens to spread. Romans were probably less healthy overall than their pre-urban ancestors, despite having access to more impressive infrastructure. The paradox of Roman hygiene is that it was simultaneously advanced and ineffective. Advanced because it represented a systematic, infrastructure-based approach to public cleanliness that wouldn't be matched again for more than 1,000 years. Ineffective because it was based on incorrect understanding of disease and failed to prevent the health problems it was meant to address. What lessons can we draw from this? First, that infrastructure alone doesn't ensure public health if it's not designed with accurate understanding of disease transmission. Building impressive structures isn't enough. They have to be designed correctly. The Romans built extensively but not always effectively because they lacked crucial knowledge. Second, that cultural practices around cleanliness matter, but they need to be informed by science to be truly effective. The Romans valued cleanliness and made it a central part of their identity. But because they didn't understand germs, some of their cleanliness practices actually increased disease risk. Good intentions and strong cultural values don't automatically produce good outcomes without knowledge. Third, that social inequality affects public health outcomes in profound ways. Roman hygiene was better for the rich than for the poor, better for men than for women, better for free citizens than for slaves. These inequalities meant that disease affected different groups differently, and that society as a whole was less healthy than it could have been. The best public health systems are accessible to everyone, not just the privileged. Fourth, that long-term environmental effects matter. The Romans' use of lead pipes created chronic poisoning that affected multiple generations. Their environmental manipulations, draining marshes and diverting rivers, had effects that outlasted the empire itself. Modern public health planning needs to consider not just immediate effects, but long-term consequences. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century led to the gradual abandonment of Roman hygiene infrastructure. Aqueducts fell into disrepair, baths closed, sewers became clogged and unusable. For centuries, urban Europeans lived without the sanitation infrastructure that Romans had taken for granted. Some historians argue that public health declined during the early medieval period as Roman systems disappeared, though this is debated. It wasn't until the 19th century that European and American cities began building water and sewer systems on a scale comparable to ancient Rome. Interestingly, many of these systems explicitly copied Roman designs. The development of germ theory in the mid-19th century finally provided the missing knowledge that Romans lacked, allowing engineers to design public health infrastructure that actually prevented disease rather than just managing waste. The story of Roman hygiene is hygiene, ultimately a story about human ingenuity working within the constraints of available knowledge. The Romans accomplished remarkable things with primitive tools and incorrect theories. They created a civilization that valued cleanliness and invested heavily in hygiene infrastructure. They left behind impressive ruins that still inspire awe 2,000 years later. But they also suffered from diseases that could have been prevented. They poisoned themselves with toxic substances they believed were beneficial, and they died young in a world that was far dirtier than their magnificent architecture might suggest. They lived in a paradox of their own creation, a civilization that appeared clean and was dirty, that built extensively but ineffectively, that valued hygiene highly but practiced it imperfectly. Today, when we turn on our taps and clean water flows instantly, when we flush toilets and waste disappears, when we wash our hands with soap and live free from many diseases that plagued the Romans, we're benefiting from knowledge they lacked. We understand disease transmission. We know about microorganisms. We've developed medications that can cure infections that would have been death sentences in ancient Rome. But we face our own challenges. Antibiotic resistance threatens to return us to an era when common infections were deadly. Climate change is creating new disease vectors and spreading old ones to new areas. Inadequate sanitation still affects billions of people globally. The Romans would recognize these challenges even if they wouldn't understand the science behind them. The Roman experience with hygiene offers both warnings and inspiration. It warns us that impressive infrastructure doesn't automatically ensure public health if it's not based on sound science. It warns us that cultural practices, no matter how deeply rooted, need to be examined critically to ensure they actually achieve their intended goals. It warns us that social inequality undermines public health for everyone, not just the disadvantaged. But it also inspires us. The Romans' ambition, their willingness to invest in public infrastructure, their cultural commitment to cleanliness, all of these offer positive examples. They believed that providing clean water and managing waste were legitimate concerns for government. They thought cities should be designed with public health in mind. They understood that private behaviour had public consequences and that collective action was necessary to maintain hygiene. In the end, the story of Roman hygiene is a human story. It's about people trying to solve problems with the tools and knowledge available to them. They got some things right and many things wrong. They built magnificently and failed utterly. They lived in splendour and squalor often simultaneously. They created a civilization that valued cleanliness while being perpetually dirty.